Yves is the Executive Director of FIDE, which many of you know is the Federation for Innovation in Democracy Europe, who have been a really important actor in this space because most of the organizations in this space are delivery organizations and have to be very careful about what they say to power because they are in a contractual relationship with them. So actually having an organization whose aim is advocacy for good deliberative processes is incredibly helpful. So it was a really, from the community, grateful that you set that up. Anyway, Yves is going to talk to us about recruitment. Over to you, my friend.
I'm going to talk about recruitment, and this is a very technical part of citizen assemblies, and in part deliberative democracy. For me, the most important thing about deliberative democracy is not the recruitment. It's a bit of a strange way to start about this. It is really the process. But because it's such a lengthy process, which is intensive, you cannot do it with an amazing amount of people. And trust me, the original organization in Belgium, where deliberative democracy in my country started with, tried to do this with 1,000 people in one day in one room. So hence the organization is called G1000. The lesson learned, we actually got almost 800 people in that room, and there was a train strike, so that's where 1,000 missed. But coming back to my point is, recruitment is in some way an important part because you cannot do it with everybody. You need to make a selection of people who you let into that space. And to be honest, we have already talked about, we do have, if we talk to policymakers, they'll talk about, oh yeah, we have participation, but they'll mean stakeholder participation. So they are actually used to having smaller rooms with a smaller group of people. Just the selection of that group of people is very much skewed towards certain groups. And so from being a technical aspect, it becomes something central to the legitimacy of your process. But I do want to emphasize a lot of focus also when I'm a public speaker to policymakers is about the sortition and how do you do that lottery and et cetera, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I do want to say that kind of obsession with how we select people for citizen assemblies for me has become over the years a technical aspect. We know how different ways to do it, but it is just a selection mechanism because you need a smaller group of people. I need to move this way. Thank you, Miguel. He even tells me where to move. I'm the director, but in the end, I'm a puppet on his instructions. So, well, my organization has been introduced. This is actually a picture from our last climate assembly, which was in Milan last year, so nice introductory photo. So recruitment, what will I talk about? I'll first give you a case where I was involved in the recruitment. So I have a background in academia and in statistics, so a little odd thing in my CV which allows me to write statistical programs and statistical software to help do a sortition. So in the beginning when I was doing this work, we sometimes helped some public authorities do that when they didn't have the funding for it. So I'll present a case where I was involved in doing that, also giving some advice on how to do, how to design the recruitment. I'll talk a bit about why sortition, what is the advantage of doing this, why do we actually use this, because it is a lengthy and sometimes expensive process. I'll go into how does it work. I'll focus on one way of doing it, mainly with letters, but I'll also talk about a few other ways you can do that if that wouldn't work. And I'll talk about some specific issues, and then afterwards, as you know by now, you will have loads of time for questions and input yourself. Most of my presentation is based on a guidance document we have at FIDE on organizing a democratic lottery. So please, again, the QR code, you will find all that information once you get out of this room, if you want to reread this, where we go into some more detail and etc. So, but the core of what I will present, you can all find there. So, what is my case? We also try to diversify the cases a bit. So mine is a local case. Mid-sized town in my country, Leuven. It's a university town, 100,000 people. So it's a smallish university town, but big enough to have its own kind of clear policy services. They have a participation service. It's what is the issue that Leuven was looking at? Leuven wants to be a climate leader. And it's actually been recognized as one. So already now 14 years ago, I think, they set the target of 2030 being climate neutral. They set up a specific NGO where the city was just one part of the NGO. So they worked with business, with the university, which owns a lot of the land and is the biggest employer in the city. NGOs, but also citizens can be part of it. So they set up a specific governance structure called Leuven 2030, Leuven 2030. And so they continuously monitor policy actions to reach climate neutrality in 2030. This specific project was about a neighborhood to the east of the city called KULeuven. Just for a small detail, I actually lived there, so it was fun to do a recruitment in the place where I live myself. As you can see, this is the historical medieval town of Leuven, where the university is, the students live. By the way, 50,000 students for 100,000 inhabitants, so they're very present. But this is where students, universities, by now more people live here than there. Yes, and this neighborhood, what are the specific issues? I've drawn a red line. This is where people work, this is where people live. Yes? As you can see, there are two main arteries, and I didn't take it, but here you have, I would call the richer suburban areas, the people who have the spin-offs from the university and have their villas in the green. But so there's a lot of traffic coming from here, and here you have what on Sundays and Fridays is the most densely trafficked railway station in the country, because all those students in my country go home for the weekend. So you have like a trolley army twice a week over that railway station. But good 19th century city planning, when this could still be done, you want a railway through a city. I don't know if this picture, you just dig a trench in the middle of the city and you just put five or six. So actually this is Leuven, yes? And here you have KULeuven. It is really a trench, right? So yeah, I can see your face like it's, so the picture is taken here. So you can see there's actually only two ways to cross into the city from here, yes? Why I'm giving you this case, it's a local case, and I think it's a general problem you see in many cities is now redesigning mobility, yes? Part of climate goals is getting less cars into your city, but of course there is a limited number of parking spaces, there's very vocal groups, and so of course this is where they wanted to redesign mobility, but also general planning in this area. Yes. Now, of course, what are some of the issues to redesign this with citizens, which was the goal of the city of Leuven? Well, one of the things is it's a university town. So whereas your highly educated are already very vocal, this is a place like Oxford or Heidelberg or Krakow, or most countries have one of these places where small town, but like a lot of university people. So they're very present. I'm one of them, yes. And so very vocal. You organize an open meeting, those people will show up, yes. But another very known factor that every policymaker knows when you touch upon mobility is neighborhood groups. We have a neighborhood committee. Some of these neighborhood committees are representative. Some of them are just 10 people who meet in somebody's living room ever so often and are the people who want to stop every change. So you have the NIMBY risk. You know this acronym, I guess, not in my backyard. You have these little neighborhood groups who are like, traffic. If you start diverting traffic here, every neighborhood group will go like, not through us, right? So, but this meant they wanted to get one-way streets here, block some, make some stops so you couldn't have traffic go through them. Of course, everybody wants the car somewhere else. So they had that problem. It's very international for a small city. Leuven has 166 nationalities for 100,000 inhabitants. So it's the number of nationalities of a capital city in a very small place. So it's a very diverse population. And it has a lot of cyclists and pedestrians, but an immense amount of cars and buses going through this. So not only do you have the railway station here, here you also have the biggest bus station in the whole province. So the amount of buses, because you have your students, but you also have thousands of young people going to secondary education there. So every morning it is I'm taped, so cluster, fill in the word yourself, but something needed to be done. But of course, if you do open participation, you have a risk that certain groups show up and will dominate your public engagement process. What was the solution that the city came up with is you don't want to completely close off some of these groups because you're like, it's only the university people who will talk, or it's only the NIMBY groups. These people have a right to step up. Everybody has a right to step up. The problem is, they were thinking, how can we make them not dominate the discussion? So here is a use of a citizen assembly, or a citizen panel in this case. It was only 25 people, which is a minimum, but it was in Corona, so it was also thought about spacing and etc. So probably otherwise they would have done more, but you know, do you remember this time where we had to sit 1.5 meters from each other? The idea was, we use all different types of participation methods, we combine them, but each time we do this in several steps, and each time we have a neutral group of citizens that evaluates and brings the process forward. So for example, we first have an open call about what principles should guide the redesign of this neighborhood, yes? Which they did with an online response thing. The neighborhood has 32,000 inhabitants, so over 10% of the actual, and if you look at the adult population, almost 50% went, because this is about cars and where you can drive and where you can park. So, but even in that, when they looked, 80% of the online response had higher education. So if you think of the percentage of higher educated persons in that neighborhood, you had like 40% or something. Yes, but you were missing a number of actually social, you have 2 social neighborhoods in there, tower blocks. They were probably completely absent from that. They also organized what they called participation markets. You set up a tent, you have a few graphs and maps with proposals on how this could happen, and but they also had meetings with the neighborhood groups. Yes, but each time the input was brought to the citizen panel that they decided to have drawn by lot. So a random group of citizens that would each time take in the first input, for example, those principles. They worked on those, drafted what they thought would be good principles to go forward. Then the design planners said, okay, this might look like this. They worked on a plan. That plan was presented on these open participation markets. The input went back to the citizen panel. And so they went back and forward, trying to balance all these different groups. And in the end, they had a mobility plan for the next years that was voted off by the city council. Yes, the mandate from this came from the city council. So the central core of this is so they resorted to sortition in this case to really have a group of people that balanced the people from that neighborhood. Now, why use sortition? Yes, what are some of the reasons to use sortition? Well, one of the problems we have with what are some of the problems we have with participation if you just do an open call, and we've known this for decades. This is why I have a book from 1963, one of the first empirical studies of this. The big finding of this study in 1963 was participation predominantly can be predicted by the socioeconomic status of the person. So already in 1963, very often highly educated people, gender, very often men, but that is slowly changing, yes? But like the 80% on the highly educated on the online platform would have been predicted in 1963 by Almond and Verba, right? It's the same finding. We find a lot of this, yes? Second of all, and any policymaker at the local level knows this, is you have an unbalanced representation by intensity. You have a number of citizens that will show up at these meetings, angry citizens, and they have the right to be angry. But actually, very often some policymakers know these people by name, know what their kids study and who they are, right? It's very often similar types of people that show up. They have the right to be angry. The problem is, if they are the only people in the room, you might, for example, restrict what policy changes citizens would support because you have a very unbalanced group in the room, yes? And so those two problems you can solve with sortition. Why? In some ways, random selection is egalitarian, yes? We use it a lot, yes? If we want to do a fair draw, somebody has a chance to do something or not, yes? We use a random draw. One of the most dramatic examples I can give you is that Vietnam, the draft for the Vietnam War, was done by a lottery, yes? It was seen as the most fair way to see who would have to go to war, is they would randomly draw birth dates. So it was seen as, anybody who had a statistics course will tell you there was actually a small problem with that, because the little balls weren't evenly, and they proved in a court case that actually the sortition was a bit skewed, but it had to do with the way they did it. But it was seen as a fair way, right? Fair enough, it's egalitarian. A stratified random selection, we don't do just a lottery blindly, but we stratify a lottery, which means we define criteria of who we want to have in the room. I'll get to that in a minute. That allows you to compose a group with a very diverse set of citizens, and it will enhance trust. And this trust has one very diffuse way we always say you can test this is most of the citizens in your community should be able to look at the photo of the citizens in that assembly and should think somebody like me was in there. And that somebody like me can be very different. I'll get to that. Yes, depending on some communities, the criteria might differ a bit because what people see as somebody like me was in there might actually differ. And then one of the issues talked about by Eva already is the idea of collective wisdom. The importance element of collective wisdom is you need a diverse group. This is why research has shown that groups of experts might actually sometimes be much more wrong than a group of diverse citizens, is because experts will all share a same position and suddenly move towards a more extreme or more biased position than a diverse group. So random sortition allows you to overcome this, whereas self-selected groups will return minorities. Okay, how does it work? Well, it starts with a number of questions. What do you want? Yes, the question that Kelly had is why? So the first questions you should ask yourself is, who can take part? Who can actually be in your assembly? We would always advocate anybody who lives in your community, yes? But we've seen situations where it's been limited to citizens, even for legal reasons, yes, depending on the sortition. But who can be a part? Referring to Kelly's workshop later, yes, voting age or younger. We've seen many assemblies choosing younger, yes, including 16-year-olds. Just saying, this sounds, great, but this implies things. For example, the French CESE decided we do 16, but they started on Fridays, which meant these kids had to come to Paris, so they needed a guardian to come along. They needed, so this might imply these choices really matter, so you really have to think about these. And in some cases, you can decide you want members from outside of the community. Yes, I know, Simone, you guys did one in Copenhagen on commuting, and you decided we need a number of people from outside of the old town, I think it was, to also, because they use that part of the city, even though they live in the suburbs. So we want a certain percentage of people to actually be part of the assembly because they use that part of Copenhagen for transport, and we want their input in there. Yes. So we've seen a few assemblies that have decided, one here in Budapest, also on parking, decided to also take in a percentage of people from the neighborhoods around it. Because same problem as here with your neighborhood groups, if you do an assembly just in our neighborhood, we might decide we want less parking space. Yes, get rid of all the cars, but then the cars will just move to the neighboring neighborhood. So you can in some cases also decide my assembly needs people from those who are not affected, which might be strange. The general rule is always you want everybody who can be affected by this to be in the room, but sometimes you even want to expand to that. Then, how big does the group need to be? Yes, this is also an important question. 25 is the absolute minimum. Yes, we've seen a few assemblies do 25, but it's the absolute minimum, maybe in a very local level. Because you want that diversity and that representativeness. One of the things, I'll talk about criteria next, but if you have a lot of criteria you want to add, you need to have enough people to actually make that representativeness work. Yes? But another important one, and I think Graham touched upon this earlier, is the symbolic nature, or Kelly, I think you said at some point, oh, how can 100 people represent? We did one for, at some point we did a design for a major city, a capital city of one of the big Western European countries, fill in your blanks. And at some point, one of the political parties actually changed our design because there was a small group of citizens that would just do some logistical and procedural things, but they were 25 in the design, and the big group was 100, and one of the parties says, oh, God, 25 people cannot represent our city. It needs to be 100, like strike through. So sometimes the symbolic nature matters. Even if a statistician can tell you, oh, you could do Slovakia with 30, you might still opt for 100, because the legitimacy is about the people who are not in the room looking at that group and thinking, like, yeah, seems fair enough, that group represents. So sometimes you might oversample or make it even bigger. But, and then I think all the facilitators and planners in the room will agree, budget and time. Of course, every table you add to your assembly, you might go like, why not 200 then? Well, a big cost of your assembly, if we talk about budgets, is most assemblies will pay people to show up as a token for their service. So another 100 adds to that. You will have to pay for travel costs or assistance or travel budgets and hotels. For example, the French assemblies take place in Paris. They've done one with 185 people. It cost them almost 5 million euros. A lot of the money goes into hotels in Paris for all those participants. Yes, so you have to take into account that just going like, oh, we'll do 200 then, you know, any facilitator or planner will say like, okay, that's overdoing it. So there is a sweet spot in the middle. Talk to an expert, right, when you're doing this for the first time. And then comes one of the important bits, what group should be represented? Yes, you want that diversity in the room, and so you want a number of demographic criteria represented in the room. The obvious ones that we say are almost inevitable, gender, yes? You want an equal representation of different genders in your room, so it's very balanced. Historically, as I've said, it was very unbalanced, and most parliaments are still very unbalanced, yes? You still have parliaments in Europe with 80% men or more, yes? Other criteria we always say you should in their age. You want old people, young people. Then some socio-economic criterion. Why? Because that's the one that is most often skewed, yes? You very often lack people with lower education, so you want to stratify that you make sure you have these groups in. And then finally, very often there is region, locality. If you do this in a national assembly, you want them from all the provinces or the regions. If you do this in a big city, you want them from all the neighborhoods. So that's very often the main demographic criteria. But there could be others. I'll get to that. And then one of the hinging and controversial ones is attitudinal criteria. Yes? Should you split your room depending on the topic of the assembly? Yes? It's tricky. Sometimes you need it, and the choice has always to be, for me, could the legitimacy of this assembly be challenged by not doing this? An assembly like the Scottish Climate Assembly, during the height of Extinction Rebellion, you had a risk that people would think like, but they only selected climate activists. Yes? Maybe you want to prove that you do have people in the room that also were I wouldn't say very skeptic on climate, because that's a little minority in your population, actually, but people who, for example, think climate action is not a priority. Yes? It is very tricky, and our guidance gives much more information about this, but the question there is like, first of all, which question do you use? Yes? And which benchmark do you use? How many % of what do you then have? Yes? Is this a stable attitude? For example, partisanship. Many people come like, oh, we need people representing different political parties. Just know that for most people, partisanship is not a fixed element of their identity. Good percentages don't vote, but I've heard this very often. Oh, could we stratify by political parties, for example? I would say, no, don't do that. But you could have an attitudinal question in there. Yes? And then we've seen other criteria, depending on that specific question, what in your community would make people challenge it? So Damir will talk tomorrow, for example, about the one in Mostar we did in Bosnia. Ethnicity is such a sensitive issue there that I was also part of doing the selection there. I mean, it was from the start clear we needed to have these groups represented. Some of the minorities would go like if, for example, the Serbian minority is very small in Mostar, but if our selection would have a room without anybody from that group in there, you would have that minority feeling, you see, we weren't represented there. So we had to take it in. In Northern Ireland, if I'm right, they used a proxy for religion, I think household attitude. I don't know, I'm looking at Graham, if you remember it by heart. They used a question that was not religion, but to make sure that religious groups felt it's not just a room with Protestants or it's not just a room with Catholics, every group is represented. There's actually a lot of these added criteria. The weirdest, I asked a Norwegian scholar, did his PhD on this, I asked him, what's the weirdest one you know? And it was owning a pet. This was for a small one in Australia about getting rid of stray dogs. And they said like, but we need people in the room who also have pets, right? So sometimes it goes a bit far, but make sure you have these and yes. So, for example, in Leuven, what would we come up? Well, you have more women than men, by the way, in most societies. Yes, politically they're almost always underrepresented, but in an assembly, very often you will have more women than men. So in this small assembly, this meant 12, 13, more women than men. Yes. Education, this is Leuven, so 60% does have higher education, but still 40%, if you think about that online participation and other forms of participation, that 40% was very often not visible. So 40% of the group needed to be people with no higher education. We split age in 4 groups, yes, to have younger, older people. But then this was about mobility. So the city was also, we need a number of elements in there. For example, that the car owners can't go like, but you only picked a number of these universities, cycle lovers. So this is this one. We asked, what is your main mode of transportation? Now, they actually had a benchmark for this, because this is a great question, but how do you divide it? So they actually have a city monitor every 5 years, I think, asking people these types of questions. Yes, so they asked thousands of people loads of questions. One of them was, what is your main mode of transportation? So they actually had a benchmark that 32% in the city bikes, and only 1 out of 3 actually uses their car as a main mode of transportation. So you ask the question to people, what is your main mode of transportation? Then for the mobility aspect, it also really differs. I showed you there's 2 main roads, yes? Whether you live on one of those or not. This actually is a proxy for SES in the city, because those main roads are not super nice to live on. It's a lot of traffic, it's buses, and so you have a lot more problems with that traffic if you live there than if you live in one of the nice suburbs. So and then type of housing. Because questions were also going to be about parking spaces and etc. If you're one of the well-earning people at the university of a spin-off, you might have a nice townhouse with 2 parking spaces in front of your house. You'd be like, yeah, take a few parking spaces out of the street to build some trees. But if you live in an apartment, that is the only spot you can do. So to make sure we did have a proxy that not only well-off people would clear out all the parking spaces, And so this is what we used. So I'll quickly run through how you do this practically, and that's what I mean. It's a very technical thing, but it's first of all, you draw a few thousand, and depending, I'm not going to get into details, it's a Q&A, I can get into that. I've known places that have sent out 1,000, I've known places that have sent tens of thousands. Yes, you draw a few thousand names from a register that actually holds all the ones you've chosen, yes, and send them a letter of invitation. It should look like a wedding invitation. I'm stealing this from, I think, Art O'Leary or Ian Walker, I don't know. You should really write a letter that is not, it needs to be official and look official, but it actually needs to motivate people to go like, yeah, wow, this is important, and I've been selected for that. I'll give away a few of my weekends for that. Yes, so here is an example from the Welsh Assembly. There was a small card, yes. It says who invites you, yes. Some mayor, an official person invites you, yes, you as a citizen. So what is it about? What is the topic? An important part, for example, in this recruitment, it actually says, take part and receive £200. You might find this a bit controversial, but actually we think people should be paid for their time. We actually do it with politicians. They get a stipend. If they go to a commission meeting, they get some extra money. So I think it's not strange. We would say if people give up their weekend, we remunerate them also for the costs they will make by not doing stuff, or maybe they need childcare, etc. Yes. So here, and also I think in Scotland, they just printed it on the envelope. This is very important for the groups who actually, for whom this is needed. And so I don't think we should be, arrogant about this and go like, this is too obvious to, no. I mean, for some people, this is really what makes them be able to take part or not. This is one from Mechelen, a similar city than Leuven, where I did this. Nice layout, and just what is it? You want to be one of the 50. What are we doing? So it needs to be very clear, and you need to think the average person, also in Western Europe, reads at a 14 age reading capacity. Yes? Don't make your letter too complex. Write it for that type of literacy age. So, but it should be nice, engaging, and here at the end, I mean, this is not a signed one. It is the mayor, so it's really an official letter coming to you. So, quickly, you don't have a register of inhabitants. Our guidance will go through. Other solutions that have been used is, for example, address lists. Yes, the ever so many mailboxes, you put one in, etc. You can buy address lists in some cases. Becomes more expensive. Phone, yes, even if that is an option. The French, for example, used phones for their National Assembly. Did cost them 250,000 euros approximately, or between 200,000 and for a National Assembly, because you need to call a lot of people. You need somebody to man those phone banks. So letters are cheaper than this. And a number of experiences have been done with going door to door, just knocking on doors, sending out letters first, but much less letters, and then going to every door and try to talk to the people. This can be very culturally dependent. In some places, this works very, very well. In other places, it's shown mixed results because people are not really happy to open the door and let people in. How to make sure people say yes, must seem to matter, stipend, and then measures to promote inclusion. In your letter, there should be a fact. You have a child, we will take, there'll be childcare, or we find a solution for you. Other that have been used, depending on your resources, translation. The Brussels government translates their letter into 7 languages, yes? And even has like a code where you can listen to the letter if you can't read it. So a buddy system. Yes, you can bring somebody if you think this is very hard. You can bring, so also in Brussels, for example, we've seen people, elderly people from an immigrant background come with their son who would then translate and help. Put in your letter, let us know how we can help. There might be things you don't think about, so an open kind of question if there are things we can help you with. All of this depends on your means and resources, of course. So then for some groups, you might to move out of the lottery. again, read the guidance, but there might be some groups you just don't reach with a letter. Some types of minorities or ethnic groups that actually, or that don't trust the government, won't open that letter. And then if you have good data on your population, you might actually send more letters to some districts than others. If you know there's a district with a certain population that is much less likely to participate, you can send more letters to that district than to a highly educated district where you know people will be very willing to participate. Yes? Step 2, and this is going to be very quick because this is the quickest. If you've done all that work, your letters will come back in, and then you find that somewhere between 2 and 20%. And this really, a lot of this hinges on a lot of criteria. One of the important ones is it matters. This is very hard, for example, for civil society sometimes to do recruitment, because you will have to write a letter or invite people to say, like, we are civil society XYZ, we're running something, and we want to know what people think. Could you give us 5 of your weekends? It's sometimes a bit harder than the mayor saying, I'm going to change a law and I want your input. It feels like I'm really going to have an effect on something, or the prime minister's office signing the letter. So anything between 2 and 20%. This actually defines how much letters you send out in the beginning. Of course, you're going to say, I don't know this already, but talk to experts. There are some really, there's some idea of the wiggle room in between. And then you put that information in a data set, you hand it over to a software or to somebody like me who has done this, and the software will take a random draw, but that reflects those criteria. Yes, one of the things that has been done in several places is to do this last step in a physical way, again, to heighten legitimacy. Yes. So, for example, I know in Poland, they've used rolling a dice. You draw a few assemblies, potential assemblies, you put them in envelopes, you give them a number, and then a child rolls a dice, and you take, so that even there, in Belgium, the German-speaking region, there's a senior judge that oversees this, kind of like looks over. So there is a sense of, this is not just some black box that, again, nobody ever asks this information, by the way, but you have to do it. It's a bit like open governance, right? You have to be transparent and clear, even though nobody ever, I think in Ostar, we offered the software and we filmed it. I don't think it got a lot of views on YouTube, but it is there. And I'll show you an example why you have to do it. And then finally, you have to do onboarding. Yes, call the people that have said yes. You know, hey, welcome. I know your boss, Zakia, loves calling people and saying, you won the lottery, you're part of the group. And then it's really onboarding them, that they actually show up, right, between the time they said yes and you selected them. So the ground rule for everything in this, for me, is at any step you need to make sure it is transparent for an outsider and it can be seen as a legitimate procedure. And yes, you will have that one idiot on Twitter. Yes, I mean, this is from this weekend. So a good friend of ours, Jonathan, who does a lot of this work in Brussels, he's very active on Twitter. Yes, and over the years, he's attracted, like anything on Twitter, attracted those 5 or 6 idiots who every time respond to. So he was here tweeting about an assembly that had its last meeting in Brussels this weekend, and you can see selected from amongst your activists, guided by your experts, and miraculously, the restitution corresponds to the ideas of your party. What a beautiful circumvention of democracy based on suffrage. These charades are closer to the plenum of the Chinese Communist Party than to Western democracy. The fun thing is Jonathan will always just post the link to, here is the procedure. If you find something, come back to me. Yes? Like, here is all the stuff, go through it. So you need to make sure that if these people, but also a political party goes like, but you've tweaked this, especially if it's seen as partisan, as we talked earlier, that you can respond to this. So, and then this is what you end up with, a group of regular people. And for example, one of the ones also through COVID, I've been to Mostar now a few times, but I did the selection for this group, and these people were numbers in my computer system, because you don't have the names when you do that last sortition. And so this group has been selected by me, yes? But I cannot tell you who in this group is a Serb, who is a Croat, yes, I can see women, men, but for example, don't ask me to point out who is highly educated in this group or who, if you look at this photo, this is a random group of citizens from Mostar. Yes, so this is the Permanent Assembly of Oost-Belgium. Your older person, younger person. One of these person, I think, works in a lab at the university. So this is your mixed group of, and this is a group of 25, by the way, so you have a bit of everything in there. This is the Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat. Yes? And by the way, these groups become like a family at some point. Actually, I saw this weekend one of this group, now one of the oldest members died. And I saw like lots of tributes from the other members on LinkedIn, on Twitter. They're really like a community. And so here is your random group. Now, these are the questions for the table work, so I'll first give the floor to Graham. Thank you.